What if the most important clue in a double homicide wasn't the blood, the weapon, or even the bodies, but a bedroom no one was supposed to pay attention to? Let that sit for a moment. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because in the days after Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, were found stabbed to death inside their $13.5 million Brentwood estate, most of the public attention locked onto the obvious. The brutality, the shock. The Sun arrested the very same night. The word homicide stamped coldly onto official paperwork. The phrase multiple sharp force injuries repeated again and again until it almost lost its meaning. Almost. But behind the police tape, beyond the headlines, and far away from the flashing cameras, investigators were quietly focused on something else. Something smaller. Something more intimate. Something far more disturbing. A bedroom. Not the bedroom where the bodies were found. Another one. And once you understand why federal investigators cared so deeply about that room, you begin to realize this case may not be what it first appeared to be at all. Here's the part that should stop you cold. By the time the FBI reportedly took interest in Nick Reiner's bedroom, he was already in custody, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. From the outside, the story looked finished before it even began. Arrest made. Suspect named. Narrative locked. So why keep digging? Why bring in federal-level scrutiny when local law enforcement already had a suspect, a location, and a timeline? And more unsettling still, what did they find that was serious enough to change everything, according to those familiar with the investigation? Because this wasn't just about what happened on Sunday, December 14th. It was about what may have been happening long before that day ever arrived. The Reiner home sits in one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods, Brentwood. A place where manicured hedges hide more than just wealth, where privacy is currency, where neighbors wave politely but rarely know what's happening behind the gates next door. From the street, the estate looked like safety itself. Tall walls, controlled access, clean lines, a place designed to keep danger out. But danger doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it's already living there. Sunday, December 14th, was supposed to be unremarkable, quiet, routine. The kind of day that blends into memory without leaving a mark. But by the end of it, 2 people were dead, a family was shattered, and one name would be splashed across headlines nationwide. Reiner and Michelle were found inside their home, both victims of what authorities later described as multiple sharp force injuries. The manner of death, homicide. The date of death, Sunday, December 14th, a detail that initially sparked speculation and confusion before being formally confirmed. Those words are clinical, cold, almost sterile. They don't capture the violence implied, the repeated motion, the closeness required, the rage or panic or desperation that forensic experts say often accompanies such wounds. This wasn't distance. This wasn't remote. This was personal. And then came the arrest. Nick Reiner, 32 years old, the couple's son, living not inside the main house, but in a guest house on the property. Close enough to be part of the family's daily life, yet separate enough to exist in his own orbit. He was arrested the same night. Think about that. No prolonged manhunt. No days-long search. No mystery suspect at large. The story seemed to resolve itself almost immediately. But cases that close too fast often leave the most unanswered questions. Reports soon surfaced that the bodies were discovered by the Reiner's daughter, Romy, 27. According to those reports, she allegedly told police something chilling, that there was a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. Imagine the weight of that moment. Your parents are dead. Your home is a crime scene. And instead of pointing outward, you point inward. What does it take to say something like that out loud? What did she know? What had she seen? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all. Why didn't this warning shock investigators as much as it should have? Because if someone inside the family was already seen as dangerous, that suggests this wasn't a bolt from the blue. It suggests history, tension, fear that didn't begin on December 14th. It suggests warning signs. And warning signs have a way of leaving traces. As news spread, public reaction followed a familiar pattern. Outrage, horror, speculation, social media threads filling with theories. Comment sections divided between those convinced of guilt and those urging restraint. But behind the scenes, the investigation was still unfolding, and it wasn't unfolding where most people were looking. While cameras focused on the main house, investigators were quietly paying attention to the guest house, and more specifically, to the space inside it where Nick Reiner slept. Now ask yourself this. What does a bedroom really reveal? Bedrooms are where people let their guard down, where they retreat from performance, where habits live, where obsessions accumulate, where thoughts, plans, fears, and fantasies often leave physical evidence behind. A bedroom isn't just a room. It's a psychological map. Law enforcement knows this. Behavioral analysts know this. Federal investigators know this better than most. Which is why, when reports later emerged that the FBI had taken interest in Nick's bedroom, it raised an entirely new set of questions. Because the FBI doesn't show up to confirm what everyone already believes. They show up when something doesn't fit. And according to those familiar with the case, what they encountered inside that room wasn't just concerning. It was contradictory. Contradictory to the timeline. Contradictory to the motive. Contradictory to the idea that this was a sudden, explosive act with no warning. And if that's true, then this case isn't just about a violent night in December. It's about what led up to it. Think about the phrase multiple sharp force injuries again. Forensic experts often say that repeated stabbing suggests more than intent. It suggests emotion, escalation, sometimes even rehearsal, not in the literal sense, but in the mental one. Acts like these rarely exist in isolation. They are usually preceded by something. Stress, conflict, obsession, a breaking point that doesn't come out of nowhere. So the question becomes unavoidable. Was December 14th the beginning or the end of the story? As investigators worked to piece together the final hours of Reiner and Michelle's lives, they were also forced to look backward, to examine family dynamics, to revisit prior interactions, to ask whether the danger Romy allegedly warned about had been visible long before blood was spilled. And this is where the narrative begins to fracture. Because when you look closely at families like this, wealthy, private, insulated, you often find that problems don't disappear. They get buried, managed, explained away, until they can't be anymore. Neighbors may not hear arguments. Friends may not see fractures. But inside the walls, patterns form. And patterns leave evidence. Which brings us back to that bedroom. According to sources, what was found there wasn't just interesting. It wasn't just relevant. It was significant enough to force investigators to reevaluate what they thought they understood. Significant enough to suggest premeditation where spontaneity was assumed. Significant enough to raise questions about timing. Significant enough to imply that the violence may have been imagined or even anticipated before it was ever carried out. Now pause here and ask yourself, if you were innocent, what would your private space look like? And if you weren't, what would it reveal? Because the most unsettling truth about criminal investigations is this. People often tell on themselves long before they act. They write things down. They save things. They collect things. They rehearse things. And sometimes, they leave those things right where they sleep. At this stage, the public doesn't know everything investigators know. Much of what was reportedly found remains sealed, analyzed, contextualized by professionals trained to read meaning where others see chaos. But what is clear is this. The story authorities first presented, a tragic but straightforward family murder, began to feel less straightforward the deeper they looked. And the deeper they looked, the more the focus shifted away from the obvious crime scene and toward a room that wasn't soaked in blood at all. A room that was quiet, orderly, personal, and possibly far more revealing than the scene of the crime itself. Because sometimes the truth doesn't scream. Sometimes it waits. And as investigators stood inside that bedroom, carefully cataloging what they saw, one realization began to form, slow, heavy, and impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about what Nick Reiner did. It was about who he may have been becoming. And what came next would change everything. Because the house that everyone thought they understood was about to reveal a side no one saw coming. From the outside, it looked perfect. A pristine facade of wealth and security, a $13.5 million Brentwood estate nestled behind high walls and iron gates. Every angle of the property screamed control and order. Manicured gardens, geometric hedges, and a driveway that could swallow 10 luxury SUVs without feeling crowded. On the street, neighbors waved politely, smiled, and moved on. To an outsider, This was a sanctuary, the kind of home that radiates safety and comfort. But the truth, as investigators would soon realize, was far more complex, far darker. Walk past the gates, and you begin to notice the subtle contradictions. There's a separation in the architecture that hints at privacy beyond just luxury. The main house looms large, imposing yet elegant, while a smaller guest house sits at a deliberate distance, close enough to feel part of the compound, but separate enough to suggest independence. That's where Nick Reiner, the son accused of a horrific double murder, had been living. Behind closed doors, a small building that should have symbolized autonomy may have become a prison of sorts, or perhaps a hiding place for something darker. Luxury homes are often designed to impress outsiders. They showcase power, taste, and wealth. But inside those walls, appearances don't always align with reality. Investigators know this. Behavioral analysts know this. Family tragedies like the Reiners often reveal patterns invisible to the untrained eye. The subtle tensions, the silent arguments, the carefully concealed conflicts that fester until they explode. The main house, where Reiner and Michelle lived, was classic Brentwood sophistication. Open layouts, high ceilings, sunlight filtering through expansive windows, and every amenity imaginable. To the casual visitor, it was welcoming and warm. But to those who knew how to look, the home's very design offered insight into family dynamics. The guest house, small and separate, was not just a residence. It was a statement, an invisible barrier, a physical representation of distance, emotional, relational, and perhaps psychological. Those walls would come to hold secrets investigators could hardly have imagined. The estate's history adds another layer. Homes like this are rarely built by accident. They're curated experiences. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, even the placement of doors and windows contributes to an invisible narrative about the people who live there. In the Reiners' case, the home reflected both wealth and structure, comfort and isolation. And as the investigation unfolded, the estate itself became almost a character, silent, observing, withholding. On December 14th, the estate would transform from sanctuary to crime scene. But even before that, patterns of daily life had been quietly shaping the circumstances that led to tragedy. A home like this fosters separation as much as connection. Parents in the main house, adult children in the guest house, interactions scheduled, monitored, contained. To the outside world, it's neat and orderly. Inside, it can breed resentment, alienation, and sometimes danger. The layout of the property also had practical implications for the investigation. The main house had multiple exits, making ingress and egress difficult to monitor without cameras or staff. Meanwhile, the guest house offered both privacy and isolation, providing a space where conflicts could go unnoticed, behaviors could be concealed, and preparations, of any kind, could take place without scrutiny. Investigators would later note that this separation made the case more complicated, because while the scene of the murders was obvious, the actions leading up to them were hidden in plain sight, shielded by walls that seemed ordinary but were anything but. Inside, the main house held the Reiners' lives, family photos, heirlooms, and everyday reminders of what they had built. But in spaces like this, comfort and danger can coexist. A home designed for privacy may inadvertently shield violence, and a room meant for peace can become a staging ground for tragedy. Investigators understand that the physical environment often mirrors mental and emotional states. Wide-open spaces may conceal hidden tensions. Locked doors may hide conflicts the world isn't meant to see. The Reiners' estate, despite its perfection, held both these truths. The guest house, in particular, became a focal point. It was modest compared to the main house, yes, but still elegant, well-maintained, and functional. Yet its very modesty may have played a role in what happened. A smaller, less monitored space allows for activities to go unnoticed. And when investigators finally entered Nick Reiner's room, they would find that the significance of the space went beyond mere living quarters. Objects, patterns, and arrangements inside would suggest a narrative entirely separate from the visible family life in the main house. Behavioral analysts often describe homes as mirrors of the mind. In this case, the Reiners' property was a mirror fractured into sections. Each building, each room, Each hidden corner reflected different aspects of family life, control, and autonomy. The main house represented parental authority and legacy. The guest house represented independence and perhaps isolation. The intersections of these spaces, both physical and psychological, would be critical to understanding the events of December 14th. Neighbors and staff who spoke with investigators painted a picture of a property alive with tension but silent to the outside world, while the landscaping, the gates, and the architecture projected control and calm. People familiar with the family hinted at friction, resentment, and unease. It's a pattern not uncommon in elite households, where privacy can both protect and hide. To outsiders, nothing seems amiss. To insiders, danger may have been simmering quietly for years. The estate also presented logistical challenges for law enforcement. Multiple buildings, sprawling grounds, and separate entrances complicated crime scene management. Ensuring evidence was preserved required meticulous coordination, but it also allowed the investigators a unique lens. They could observe the physical separation between the Reiners and their son, a separation that may have mirrored emotional and psychological distance, a distance that could have contributed to tragedy. Within those walls, investigators would later trace behavior patterns and familial interactions that hinted at both conflict and concealment. Reports suggested the guest house was well kept, orderly, and seemingly benign, a place where one could live unnoticed. But the very ordinariness of the room masked deeper significance. Because inside that guest house, inside that bedroom, was evidence that challenged assumptions, forced investigators to reconsider motives, and raised profound questions about the family's private life. It's worth pausing to consider the implications. A home is supposed to be a safe space, a refuge from the world. But when tension builds over years, when conflicts are hidden behind closed doors, and when individuals isolate themselves, that same home becomes a trap. Comfort and danger, security and violence coexist within the same walls, waiting for a trigger to expose the hidden reality. On December 14th, the estate transformed from a carefully curated environment into a forensic puzzle. Every room, every hallway, every object potentially held significance. But the guest house, the bedroom where Nick Reiner lived, held a secret that would prove critical. Not immediately obvious, not covered in early reports, not broadcast in headlines, but central to understanding the sequence of events and the behavior of those involved. Investigators often say that understanding a crime begins with understanding the environment in which it occurred. In the case of the Reiners, the environment was multi-layered. A main house symbolizing parental presence and legacy. A guest house providing autonomy and seclusion. Landscaped gardens, hidden pathways, and walls that offered both beauty and concealment. Every element played a role, whether through intention or accident, in the unfolding tragedy. By focusing on the house itself, the investigation began to reveal patterns that had long been invisible. How did family members interact across physical spaces? What behaviors were allowed to go unnoticed? How might the design of the estate have facilitated conflict or concealment? Questions like these framed the investigative approach and shaped the early theories about motive, opportunity, and premeditation. The house, in other words, hid everything. From the outside, perfection. From the inside, tension. From certain rooms, evidence waiting to be discovered. The contrast between perception and reality would become a central theme as investigators moved from room to room, piecing together the story that the Reiners' walls were trying to tell. And the room that mattered most, Nick Reiner's bedroom in the guest house, would become the key to understanding not just the crime, but the hidden narrative of a family unraveling behind closed doors. What investigators found there would not just supplement the story, it would force them to rewrite it. The house hid everything. But no matter how carefully a space is curated, there are always traces left behind. The Reiners' estate, with all its luxury and privacy, was no exception. Every corner, every doorway, every item told a story, and investigators were just beginning to read it. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Sunday mornings are supposed to be quiet, slow, predictable. Coffee brewing, newspapers rustling, sunlight spilling across clean floors. But December 14th, 2014, a date that would haunt the Reiner family forever, shattered all notions of routine. By the end of that day, 2 lives had been violently ended, a family had been forever fractured, and a small corner of Brentwood had transformed from tranquility into a crime scene. The morning itself, according to those piecing together timelines, began like any other. Michelle and Reiner were reportedly at home, engaged in typical weekend routines, tidying, planning the day, or simply enjoying the space they had cultivated for decades. The sun would have streamed across the estate, reflecting off polished surfaces, illuminating the meticulous care taken in every room. For most families, a morning like this passes unnoticed, almost mundane. But for the Reiners, it was the calm before a storm no one could have predicted. Reports later indicated that the bodies were discovered by Romy, the couple's 27-year-old daughter. Imagine that moment, walking into the home you've known all your life, only to be confronted with the unimaginable. Horror, disbelief, and the instinct to act immediately would have collided within seconds. The human mind struggles to process extreme events in real time, and Romy's reaction, alerting authorities while also warning about a dangerous family member, suggests a clarity that is both chilling and remarkable. It's rare to speak with precision under such shock, especially when pointing towards someone so close. The initial police response was swift but careful. Officers had to secure the scene, assess safety, and begin the meticulous process of evidence collection. When bodies are involved, every action is scrutinized. Investigators follow strict protocols, photographing, documenting, and collecting evidence in a sequence that preserves the chain of events. But in sprawling estates like the Reiners, the physical layout complicates everything. Multiple entrances, separate buildings, and discrete living spaces mean that evidence can be isolated, hidden, or overlooked if not thoroughly examined. From the earliest moments of the investigation, inconsistencies began to emerge. Witness accounts, preliminary forensic observations, and timelines presented by family members sometimes conflicted. Even minor discrepancies, a door found open, an item out of place, a time remembered differently, can become pivotal in homicide cases. The investigators were aware of this, and it's why, from the very beginning, their attention was drawn not just to the obvious murder scene, but to surrounding spaces that could hold clues, hallways, offices, and, crucially, bedrooms. Consider the emotional weight of the discovery. Romy found the bodies of her parents. It is impossible to overstate the psychological strain this imposes. Trauma like this is instantaneous yet cumulative, embedding memories in ways that later become critical in court or analysis. The investigators had to navigate Romy's emotional state carefully. She was a witness, a victim of circumstance, and possibly a source of critical insight into family dynamics and potential motives. The questions her presence raised, about timing, warning signs, and pre-existing tensions, would dominate early discussions among detectives. Meanwhile, the narrative that the media was constructing began to crystallize quickly. Headlines emphasized the shock: a wealthy couple murdered in their own home, a son arrested, and a family in turmoil. Social media echoed the same points, often simplified, often dramatized. Yet the investigators could not rely on public perception. They knew better. Homicides, particularly those involving family members, rarely fit neatly into the narratives outsiders construct. Patterns, motivations, and hidden dynamics often contradict what is visible at first glance. The initial observations at the scene included clear evidence of violence. Multiple sharp force injuries indicated a struggle, a close-range attack, and perhaps a personal motivation that went beyond ordinary conflict. While official reports described the injuries clinically, investigators understood that the nature of the wounds could suggest more than mere anger. They could indicate emotional intensity, premeditation, or even prolonged engagement. Such nuances often influence whether investigators treat a case as spontaneous versus calculated. Early timelines were constructed to pinpoint the exact time of death, though speculation persisted initially. Some accounts placed the discovery earlier than official reports. Others suggested that warning signs may have preceded the attack by hours, even days. Establishing an accurate timeline is critical in murder investigations. It not only informs the sequence of events, but also provides context for potential motive and opportunity. Investigators would spend days cross-referencing phone records, surveillance footage, neighbor accounts, and forensic evidence to create a coherent chronology. And then there was the arrest. Nick Reiner, 32, living in the guest house on the estate, was taken into custody that same night. The speed of the arrest was remarkable, yet it raised questions for some experts. Was the case fully understood, or had authorities acted on circumstantial evidence bolstered by proximity and familial connection? High-profile cases often carry pressure to resolve quickly, but thoroughness is paramount. In this instance, while the arrest closed one part of the narrative, it opened many others, particularly regarding what may have occurred inside the guest house prior to the murders. As investigators began their work, they had to consider family dynamics carefully. Romy's statements regarding a dangerous family member were not taken lightly. Such remarks suggest a pre-existing tension, a history of problematic behavior, or even prior threats. Investigators know that in domestic homicide cases, prior warning signs are often critical to understanding motive. Ignoring these can lead to oversights in both evidence collection and narrative construction. The forensic examination of the main house and surrounding areas was exhaustive. Every surface, object, and room was scrutinized for traces of the events leading up to the murders. The presence of multiple buildings on the property required careful coordination. Officers had to maintain the integrity of both the crime scene and the surrounding environment, knowing that evidence might exist in unexpected locations, a guest house bedroom, a garage, even the garden pathways. Every piece of the property was a puzzle piece, and investigators had to see the full picture to make sense of it. Emotional impact on the investigators themselves cannot be ignored. Homicides involving family members are uniquely challenging. There is an added layer of psychological complexity, empathy, and moral weight. Officers had to navigate not only the evidence but the human drama, grief, fear, and shock that surrounded them. They were not just examining a crime scene. They were witnessing the aftermath of intimate, personal violence, and their decisions could affect both the investigation and the lives of those still grieving. By the afternoon and evening of December 14th, a picture began to emerge, but one with many missing pieces. The bodies were removed for autopsy. Nick Reiner remained in custody. Romy had provided statements. The public narrative focused on tragedy, shock, and immediate family betrayal. But the investigators' narrative was more complex. Every room, every interaction, every anomaly was being cataloged, and all eyes were increasingly turning toward spaces beyond the immediate crime scene. Particularly the guest house and the bedroom within it, which held the potential to explain not just what happened, but why. The day had started with sunlight spilling over a peaceful neighborhood. By nightfall, the estate was a hive of activity, with police tape, flashing lights, and investigators moving methodically through rooms, hallways, and courtyards. The veneer of calm was gone. What remained was a property filled with questions. How did it escalate to murder? Were there signs that were missed? And most importantly, what role did Nick Reiner's living space play in the events that had unfolded? And here's the part that would haunt investigators for months to come. While the main house was the obvious crime scene, the narrative was incomplete without examining the guest house bedroom, the private space where Nick Reiner lived. That room, seemingly ordinary, would eventually provide insights so significant that the entire understanding of the murders, motive, timing, premeditation, would be challenged. Investigators began to realize that sometimes the most revealing evidence isn't at the site of the crime itself, but in the spaces adjacent to it, quietly holding the story of what led there. The collapse of that day, December 14th, was not only the loss of 2 lives. It was the beginning of an investigation into a family's hidden world. The tensions, secrets, and unspoken conflicts that the walls of the Brentwood estate had silently observed. And as night fell and the bodies were taken, investigators prepared for the work ahead, fully aware that the most critical discoveries might not yet have been made. The quiet rooms, the locked doors, the carefully curated spaces, all of these could hold the keys to understanding not just the crime, but the complex, hidden dynamics that had made it possible. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Most people freeze in moments of extreme shock. Some cry, some flee, some collapse into numb disbelief. But Romy Reiner, 27 years old, did something else entirely. She spoke. Not just words, but warnings. Words that investigators later described as chilling in their precision. There's a dangerous family member. You should look at him. Imagine the weight of that statement. Your parents are dead. The home you've known all your life is a crime scene. The police are asking questions, seeking clarity, gathering evidence. And you point inward, to a person with whom you share blood, history, and memories. It's not just a remark. It's a declaration, a signal, a choice to speak truth amid grief, even when that truth could destroy everything you've known. In domestic homicide cases, statements like Romy's are pivotal. They shift the investigative focus. They suggest pre-existing tension, prior incidents, or a history of behavior that others may have ignored or dismissed. Investigators rely on such warnings to contextualize evidence, understand motive, and anticipate potential complications. Romy's remark immediately raised red flags, because in most family homicides, prior warning signs are often subtle, misinterpreted, or hidden entirely. Consider the psychological implications. Romy, herself a young adult navigating family dynamics, had likely witnessed patterns over time. Maybe small incidents, arguments, or behaviors that seemed insignificant at first, minor threats, strange obsessions, subtle manipulations. But in retrospect, these small signals form a tapestry of forewarning. Her ability to identify danger suggests she had been observing, consciously or unconsciously, the potential for escalation long before the fatal event. Investigators later noted that her warning could not be dismissed lightly. In family homicides, the most dangerous individuals are often those closest to the victims. Blood ties, intimacy, and familiarity provide both opportunity and motive. The very relationships that offer love and connection also provide access and, unfortunately, the capacity for harm. Romy's statement encapsulated this uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the threat exists not in the shadows outside, but in the spaces and lives intertwined with your own. Her warning also raises questions about perception and awareness. How often do we see warning signs in people we know intimately and dismiss them? How often does familiarity blind us to danger? The Reiner case provides a stark example of this phenomenon. By pointing investigators toward Nick, Romy was highlighting not just a potential perpetrator, but a pattern. A narrative of risk that had been accumulating quietly, hidden beneath the surface of family life. In the hours following her statement, investigators had to balance two critical imperatives: emotional sensitivity and investigative rigor. Romy was grieving. She was traumatized, yet her insight was potentially crucial. Law enforcement professionals understand that in moments like these, witnesses may offer observations that cut through noise, revealing truth that is otherwise obscured. Her ability to speak, calmly and clearly, in such a moment, would later be described as extraordinary by some officials involved. The content of Romy's statement also demanded scrutiny. Dangerous family member is a loaded phrase. It implies prior knowledge, perceived threat, and perhaps even fear. It is not casual. It is an assessment formed over time, based on observation, interaction, and intuition. Investigators often compare such statements against behavioral history, looking for corroborating evidence, past conflicts, prior threats, psychological evaluations, or unusual behavior. Immediately, Nick Reiner became the focal point of the investigation. His proximity to the victims, his role within the household, and now his sister's warning all converged. Arrest protocols, evidence collection, and interviews began to focus on him. But Romy's statement had another effect. It forced investigators to reevaluate the family dynamic. Murder investigations involving relatives are rarely simple. The motives, histories, and emotions involved are deeply intertwined. Understanding relationships is as critical as collecting forensic evidence. What makes Romy's warning particularly chilling is the implicit foresight it contains. She identified risk before it was fully realized, signaling awareness of potential escalation. Investigators recognize that this kind of foresight is rare. Most warnings come after violence occurs, in hindsight, when signs are obvious only in retrospect. Romy's ability to identify the danger beforehand suggests that patterns had been forming for some time. And here's the key point. Her statement was not just a warning. It was a clue. Investigators knew that behavioral analysis in family homicides often hinges on understanding prior warning behaviors. These behaviors may be subtle. Arguments, threats, obsessive behaviors, unusual secrecy, or emotional volatility. Each can be a thread in the larger tapestry of motive and opportunity. Romy's observation provided both context and direction, guiding law enforcement to areas they might otherwise have overlooked. But the situation was far from straightforward. Family dynamics are complex, and pointing to a relative carries emotional, legal, and ethical weight. Investigators had to assess the credibility of the statement while simultaneously gathering physical evidence. They had to consider, had Romy misinterpreted prior events? Was she influenced by grief or fear? Could she have been mistaken? Or was she accurately identifying a genuine threat? The answers to these questions would shape the early trajectory of the investigation. Adding another layer, investigators had to reconcile Romy's statement with forensic evidence. The nature of the victim's injuries, the scene's configuration, and the initial timeline needed to align with behavioral assessments. If her warning was accurate, it would fit within a pattern of premeditation or escalation. If inaccurate, it would need to be contextualized as emotional reaction rather than predictive insight. Romy's warning also forced law enforcement to consider the unseen, what had been happening in spaces no one else observed. Rooms, conversations, behaviors. Patterns that existed behind closed doors, invisible to outsiders, but visible to those living within the household. In family homicides, these unseen moments often contain critical clues. Investigators know that perpetrators rarely act in isolation. Their behaviors, routines, and intentions leave traces. Romy's insight suggested that such traces might exist in the Reiners' home, particularly in spaces her brother occupied. Her remark, simple in its phrasing, carried profound implications. It directed attention to Nick, yes, but also to the broader question of pre-existing conditions. What had been brewing within the Reiner family? How long had tension, resentment, or fear been present? And perhaps most importantly, what had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for investigators to uncover it? From the perspective of behavioral analysts, Romy's statement was a roadmap. It highlighted the importance of examining the suspect's living space, routines, and psychological profile. Investigators would later note that this early warning shaped their approach to evidence collection, interview strategies, and the prioritization of investigative resources. Without it, the focus might have remained solely on the crime scene in the main house, potentially missing critical clues elsewhere. In the end, Romy's warning underscores a universal truth in domestic homicide investigations. The most vital insights often come from those closest to the situation. People who know the dynamics intimately can perceive risk patterns that outsiders cannot. But recognizing and acting on these warnings requires both courage and discernment, qualities Romy demonstrated under unimaginable stress. And yet, despite her clarity, the investigation was far from complete. Nick Reiner's arrest that night closed one chapter, but the deeper questions about motive, premeditation, and the hidden dynamics within the family remained unresolved. Investigators knew that the real story, the one that would explain not only what happened but why, might lie in spaces no one had yet examined closely. The guest house, and most specifically, the bedroom where Nick lived. Romy's warning had set the stage. It was a spotlight on danger, a signal to investigators that the most critical evidence might not be at the obvious crime scene. And what came next would test every assumption, challenge every narrative, and lead investigators into spaces that would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Nick Reiner, 32 years old, son of Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, living in the guest house on the family's sprawling Brentwood estate. From the outside, he appeared like any other adult child of a wealthy, high-profile family. Independent, somewhat private, perhaps a little enigmatic. But appearances are deceiving, especially in cases like this, where family dynamics and hidden behaviors can mask reality until tragedy exposes it. From his earliest years, Nick's life had been framed by the wealth and prestige of his family. He grew up in a household where expectations were high, privacy was paramount, and appearances mattered. Observers noted that he was well-educated, articulate, and polite. The the sort of person who could navigate social settings with ease. Neighbors described him as quiet but polite, sometimes reclusive, often maintaining the distance of someone who prefers observation over participation. Yet those who knew him more intimately hinted at a different side. Friends and acquaintances recalled moments of volatility, of moods shifting quickly from calm to intense. There were reports of friction with family members, subtle tensions that often went unremarked. Investigators would later explore these accounts carefully, understanding that in domestic homicides, even small behavioral anomalies can indicate deeper underlying issues. Patterns, not isolated incidents, often reveal the truth. Nick's relationship with his parents was described by some as complex. On one hand, there were indications of affection and familial loyalty. On the other, reports suggested disagreements, frustrations, and conflicts that, while perhaps common in many families, might have taken on amplified significance in the high-pressure, high-visibility environment of the Reiner estate. Investigators knew that family homicide rarely occurs without a backdrop of tension, perceived grievance, or long-standing unresolved conflicts. His living arrangement added another layer. The guest house was separate, independent, yet close enough to the main house to observe, interact, and participate when necessary. For law enforcement, this physical separation mirrors a psychological one. It offers a space for autonomy, privacy, and control, but also isolation. And in cases of escalating domestic tension, isolation can be both a refuge and a crucible, allowing behavior to develop away from scrutiny until it manifests in tragedy. Behavioral analysts often look for patterns of isolation, obsession, and escalation in cases like these. Nick's adult life in the guest house provided all three: physical separation from authority figures, the ability to control his immediate environment, and the potential to cultivate behaviors unseen by outsiders. Investigators would later scrutinize his routines, habits, and interactions, searching for patterns that might explain both motive and timing. But Nick Reiner's public image remained largely intact, at least superficially. The arrest that night painted him as the primary suspect, yet it didn't immediately answer deeper questions about his personality, history, or mental state. In domestic homicides, understanding the suspect's inner life is as critical as analyzing physical evidence. Investigators must reconcile public perception, family accounts, and forensic data to create a coherent portrait. Accounts from friends, neighbors, and associates suggested contradictions in his behavior. Some described a calm, even charming individual. Others noted unpredictability, moments of tension, and a propensity for withdrawal. Contradictions like these are significant because they hint at internal conflict. Investigators often focus on these dualities: the outward persona versus private behavior, the performed identity versus authentic impulses. In many high-profile domestic cases, the private self tells a story that the public never sees. Nick's habits in the guest house, while seemingly ordinary, would later attract the attention of investigators. Bedrooms, personal spaces, and private environments often reveal psychological truths. Organization versus chaos, attention to detail, collection of objects, personal rituals, or even hidden documentation. These elements, when examined in conjunction with forensic evidence, can clarify motive, intent, and premeditation. Investigators know that in many domestic homicides, the most revealing clues are not found at the scene of the murder itself, but in the suspect's private world. Psychologists consulted on the case would later emphasize that behaviors often leave subtle traces over time. A locked door, a meticulously arranged desk, or a series of seemingly innocuous items can indicate obsessive thought patterns, planning, or fixation. In the Reiner case, investigators began to see that Nick's guest house bedroom might hold far more than furniture and personal belongings. It could contain the blueprint of intent, the artifacts of mindset, and evidence of emotional escalation. His relationships with family members were complex and layered. Romy's warning suggested that tension had been noticeable, at least to some. Interactions with his parents were reportedly cordial on the surface, but contained underlying friction. Investigators would later explore communication patterns, past disputes, and unrecorded incidents, understanding that family homicides rarely occur in a vacuum. Conflict, resentment, and perceived slights accumulate, often invisibly, until the emotional pressure erupts into violence. Nick's history also suggested potential triggers. Financial pressures, personal frustrations, or disputes over autonomy could have contributed to a growing sense of entrapment or conflict. Investigators consider both proximal triggers, events immediately preceding a crime, and distal factors, long-standing conditions that create an emotional and psychological environment conducive to violence. In Nick's case, both seemed relevant. The night of the murders, investigators would later note, highlighted the convergence of opportunity, access, and behavioral pattern. Being physically close to the victims in the guest house allowed for observation, monitoring, and potential intervention, or, tragically, execution. The physical layout of the estate, combined with Nick's private space, created conditions that law enforcement would classify as both convenient and consequential. Yet despite the rapid arrest, the investigation was far from complete. Nick's outward persona, polite, educated, capable, did not automatically align with the violent acts he was accused of committing. Investigators had to reconcile contradictions. How could a person appear so ordinary while allegedly committing a heinous crime? Behavioral analysts often explore these paradoxes, understanding that outward appearances rarely capture the full scope of internal dynamics. Neighbors' impressions, staff observations, and previous incidents all played a role in constructing Nick's profile. Some described him as withdrawn, others as socially adept. Such dualities are significant because they suggest an ability to compartmentalize, a trait often noted in domestic homicide cases, where individuals manage a public identity while harboring private intentions. By focusing on Nick as both a suspect and a subject, investigators could begin to explore the deeper narrative. His background, family relationships, and private environment all offered clues. Each detail, from interactions with parents to routines in the guest house, became a piece of the puzzle. Understanding Nick was critical, not just for establishing motive or opportunity, but for interpreting the evidence in his bedroom, evidence that, as investigators would soon discover, was far more telling than the crime scene itself. Nick Reiner was, in essence, the bridge between two worlds. The visible, orderly life of a wealthy family, and the hidden, turbulent undercurrents that led to murder. Investigators understood that to comprehend the full story, they had to look beyond appearances. They had to examine spaces he occupied, behaviors he displayed, and choices he made, both public and private. Only then could the narrative begin to make sense. And as the investigation zeroed in on the guest house bedroom, it became clear that Nick's private space might hold the key to understanding not just the act of murder, but the series of events, tensions, and decisions that led to that night. The room was not merely a setting. It was a lens, revealing psychological patterns, potential premeditation, and perhaps even intentions previously unseen. And what came next would force investigators to confront truths hidden within those walls. Truths that would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Bedrooms are personal spaces. They are where we retreat from the world, let down our guard, and exist in ways invisible to others. They hold our habits, our obsessions, our fears, and sometimes our intentions. In the case of Nick Reiner, investigators would soon discover that his guest house bedroom was more than just a place to sleep. It was a repository of clues, a window into his mind, and, ultimately, a space that could change the entire understanding of what happened on December 14th. From the outside, the guest house appeared modest compared to the main house. It was small, orderly, and unassuming, almost forgettable. But in domestic homicide investigations, ordinary spaces often hide extraordinary evidence. The very simplicity of the room made it easier to overlook, yet it was precisely this ordinariness that allowed behaviors to remain unnoticed, habits to develop, and intentions to form without interference. Investigators entering the room were trained to look beyond surface appearances. Every item, every object, every arrangement could hold significance. Furniture placement, personal belongings, and even the orientation of objects could suggest patterns of behavior, mental preoccupations, and potential planning. In Nick's bedroom, what seemed mundane at first glance would later reveal inconsistencies, contradictions, and insights that would challenge initial assumptions about the case. One of the first things noted was the organization or apparent organization of the room. Law enforcement sources reported that while the space was neat, there were subtle patterns suggesting meticulous attention to certain items. Personal effects were arranged in a way that hinted at ritualized behavior, careful documentation, or obsessive focus. In many cases, investigators have observed that such patterns can indicate underlying psychological processes, including planning, fixation, or emotional regulation strategies. The room reportedly contained items that, when contextualized, suggested more than simple hobbies or interests. Investigators would later describe these as behavioral signposts, pointing toward thought processes and potential premeditation. While they could not yet connect everything to the murders themselves, the presence of these items indicated a level of complexity in Nick's mental and emotional state that had not been visible from the outside. Of particular interest were materials that seemed out of place in a typical guesthouse bedroom. These included written notes, logs of interactions, or personal reflections, items that appeared to document behaviors, intentions, or even grudges. Behavioral analysts often emphasize the significance of documentation in cases like this, as it can provide direct insight into mindset, planning, and psychological state prior to a violent act. In Nick's case, the presence of such records would later force investigators to reconsider assumptions about spontaneity versus premeditation. Investigators also noted subtle environmental clues. The arrangement of the room, the orientation of furniture, and even the location of certain personal items suggested a consciousness of observation and control. It was as though the room was curated not just for comfort, but to facilitate a private environment in which behaviors could be carried out unnoticed. In domestic homicide cases, such spaces often provide crucial evidence regarding opportunity, timing, and intent. Moreover, there were indications of obsessive focus on certain objects or activities. Investigators report that attention to specific items, whether personal, digital, or physical, can provide insight into emotional states, cognitive patterns, and potential triggers. These items, while seemingly innocuous to casual observers, can be vital in understanding both the suspect's mindset and the sequence of events leading to a crime. In Nick's room, investigators found patterns that suggested careful attention, repeated focus, and behaviors that hinted at anticipation or preparation. Behavioral analysts emphasize that bedrooms are often extensions of the self. They reflect internal order, control, and emotional regulation. They also reveal contradictions. A room may appear orderly, yet contain hidden obsessions. It may appear calm, yet suggest tension. In Nick Reiner's case, investigators noted that his private space contained both elements: outward normalcy masking underlying intensity, routine masking potential fixation, and calm masking emotional volatility. The room also provided context for his relationship with his parents. Items reflecting family interactions, communications, or perceived slights could all be relevant. Investigators often examine these indicators to understand motive, resentment, or emotional buildup. In this instance, the bedroom's contents offered insight into familial tension, perceptions of conflict, and potentially long-standing grievances that might have contributed to the events of December 14th. Perhaps most significantly, the bedroom contained what investigators described as behavioral anomalies. Small, seemingly trivial details, an object out of place, a repeated arrangement of items, a pattern of notes, suggested preoccupation and focus on matters beyond ordinary daily life. While such observations alone do not establish guilt, they provide critical context, especially when combined with forensic evidence and witness statements. In cases of domestic homicide, these clues often illuminate the psychological landscape leading up to the act. Investigators also noted the interplay between privacy and exposure. The guesthouse bedroom was physically separate, offering isolation, yet connected to the estate in ways that allowed observation, monitoring, and interaction. This duality is significant. It provides both opportunity and concealment. In criminal profiling, understanding the spatial dynamics of a suspect's environment is essential, as it reveals how behaviors are conducted, concealed, and sometimes planned. The findings in the bedroom began to reshape the investigation. Initially, the focus had been on the main house, the obvious site of violence. But as evidence from Nick's private space was analyzed, it became clear that critical insights were located where investigators had not initially looked. This is a recurring theme in domestic homicides. The most revealing evidence often exists not at the site of the act itself, but in the spaces where behavior is habitual, intentions are formed, and psychological patterns are manifested. By examining the bedroom in detail, investigators began to develop a deeper understanding of the sequence of events, potential motives, and the emotional and psychological context of the crime. The room was more than a backdrop. It was a repository of narrative, a canvas upon which the patterns of behavior leading up to the murders could be traced. Every object, note, and arrangement contributed to a broader story, a story that was complex, layered, and, at times, unsettling. The guest house bedroom, in essence, became a focal point for understanding Nick Reiner's potential mindset. It offered insight into planning, preoccupation, and emotional intensity, all factors critical in evaluating the nature of the crime. Behavioral analysts often describe such spaces as mirrors of the mind, reflecting internal processes, intentions, and emotional states. In Nick's case, the mirror was complicated, revealing contradictions, obsessions, and potential motivations that were invisible from the outside. As investigators cataloged and analyzed the room, it became increasingly evident that Nick's private environment could challenge initial assumptions about spontaneity, motive, and timing. The items and patterns observed suggested the possibility of forethought, emotional buildup, and behavioral preparation. The guest house bedroom was no longer just a room. It was a key to understanding an entire narrative that had been obscured by appearances, assumptions, and the initial focus on the main house. And as the investigation moved forward, it became clear that what was discovered in that bedroom would force investigators to reconsider every aspect of the case. What had been assumed, reported, and widely accepted could no longer be taken at face value. The room held secrets, subtle, ordinary, yet profound, that would change everything. And what came next would challenge assumptions, unravel the narrative, and reveal a side of the Reiner family no one could have anticipated. By the time local authorities had secured the Reiner estate, collected initial evidence, and arrested Nick Reiner, it seemed as if the case was moving swiftly toward resolution. Yet in high-profile cases like this, especially those involving significant wealth, complex family dynamics, and potential premeditation, law enforcement often turns to federal resources for additional expertise. Enter the FBI. The involvement of the Federal Bureau of Investigation signals a turning point. Federal agents do not step in to confirm what is already apparent. They step in when questions linger, when evidence is complex, or when patterns suggest a broader or deeper scope than local authorities can manage alone. In the Reiner case, the FBI reportedly took particular interest in Nick's guest house bedroom, the same space that investigators had begun to recognize as central to understanding motive, premeditation, and psychological state. Why federal involvement? First, the FBI brings unparalleled expertise in behavioral analysis, forensic investigation, and the collection of digital and physical evidence. They are trained to see connections that local investigators might miss, particularly in cases involving subtle psychological indicators, technological traces, or high-profile families where public scrutiny adds pressure. Their presence often signals that the investigation has entered a new phase, one that may challenge initial assumptions, reveal hidden layers, and necessitate a deeper, more nuanced approach. Upon entering the guest house bedroom, federal investigators reportedly noted several points of interest that went beyond standard evidence collection. Objects that seemed ordinary at first glance were analyzed in detail. Personal items, records, and arrangements of furniture were carefully documented. Agents looked for patterns, behaviors, and potential psychological markers that could indicate premeditation, fixation, or emotional buildup. In behavioral science, these indicators are often more telling than eyewitness accounts or even forensic evidence at the primary crime scene. The FBI's methods are meticulous. Every item is photographed, cataloged, and cross-referenced. Notes are examined for content, context, and implication. Digital devices are analyzed for communications, searches, or patterns of behavior. Even the seemingly mundane, the position of a chair, a notebook on a desk, or a series of personal effects, can provide insight into mindset, emotional state, or intent. In Nick's room, federal investigators reportedly found evidence that hinted at deeper preparation or cognitive patterns not immediately apparent from the crime scene alone. The involvement of federal agents also underscores the complexity of the case. Domestic homicides can appear straightforward: suspect arrested, victims identified, crime scene documented. But in cases where motive is unclear, premeditation is suspected, or behavioral patterns suggest escalation, federal expertise ensures that no detail is overlooked. It also adds credibility to conclusions drawn, especially when the evidence may be subtle or psychological in nature. Reports from sources familiar with the investigation suggest that the FBI's presence was prompted by the discovery of these anomalies in Nick's bedroom. Items that might have been dismissed as inconsequential by local officers were subjected to rigorous scrutiny. Behavioral analysts were brought in to interpret potential signals of planning, obsession, or emotional volatility. The focus was on understanding the suspect's state of mind, patterns of thought, and possible premeditation. Critical factors in a case where family relationships and private behavior play a central role. Federal investigators also examined the interaction between the main house and the guest house. The physical layout of the estate, separate buildings, discrete pathways, and visual access points provided context for opportunity and timing.